We have the possibility of an early frost coming up as our temperatures plummet on, for me, Thursday night. And this is really quite early within the season for us to be considering a possible frost. A frost can happen anywhere from 3 degrees Celsius down. So for most of us, the chances are that this won't happen, but there are things that we can do in order just to protect our plants, because past this predicted low, we are then going back up again. So hopefully it's just one blip and then we'll go to our normal first frost dates. My normal first frost date would usually be around the 20th to the 30th of November. So as you can tell, this would be a very early frost. When we think about frost, there's a couple of different things that we need to consider. So first of all, is it going to be a very short-lived frost where it's only going to last maybe an hour or two and is unlikely to do much damage and penetrate the ground properly? And then we also have frosts that are persistent and continue on and are more likely to do a lot of damage. So these ones that we're expecting, there is every chance that we won't actually see a frost. So the 3 that I'm predicted, and in my area we can also find that the predicted temperatures are 1 to 4 degrees off either way, so I'm definitely going to be erring on the side of caution myself. Usually, however, we would expect us to have some really bright starry nights for this frost to likely to really be an issue, and it seems to be that we have a lot of wet weather around this low, so I don't think that this frost is likely to penetrate, but at the same time there are certain plants that it is not worth losing, especially when, like, our tomatoes and things like that are at their peak of ripening now. So to have to remove them all as green tomatoes would be a real shame for just one night of a possible frost. So first of all, we're going to cover the plants that are in our grow alongs and discuss what needs they may have, and then we'll go on to some other plants afterwards, and then at the end we're going to talk about some of the things that we can use in order to protect our plants and just good habits to make sure that they're going to be as best off as they can within this lower temperature. Our onions are pretty much ready to be lifted, and the only thing I'm waiting for really is for the wet weather to clear up for enough days in order to lift them when it's not been very wet, because this doesn't help them store. Luckily, they should tolerate a light frost and be absolutely fine. So there is nothing that I would suggest that we need to do for our onions. Parsnips, carrots and radish should be all absolutely fine. If anything, it should actually help them become more sweet. And then with our radish, so our summer radishes, they will tolerate the lighter frosts and be fine with a smaller amount of frosts, but they would be struggling with harder frosts later in the season. And our winter radishes are completely hardy. The asparagus that we've got growing is now at the fern stage and is dying back. So although the actual spears are not always very frost hardy, and if this was an early spring frost, then we may be looking at protecting them at that point. It's not something that I'm worried about at this stage. It's just going to maybe accelerate the breakdown of those ready for us to mulch the bed. For the blueberries, however, they are frost hardy, but the berries themselves will benefit if they are ripe from being picked. And then after that, the bushes should be absolutely fine. If they were in blossom right now, so if this was spring, then the frost would be something that would limit the amount of fruit by hurting the blossom itself. So at that point we would want to cover them, but at this time of the year that is not something that I would consider doing. And then next we have the list of things within our grow alongs that are going to need a little bit of protection or a little bit of consideration. And the first thing of that would be our potatoes. So for our older potatoes that are now dying back, there is little that we need to do with those. It's probably going to make the dieback a little bit quicker. The potatoes under the ground or under the compost in the pots should be absolutely fine and shouldn't be damaged by particularly a light frost. If you are, however, growing them as Christmas potatoes, so you've got very young plants and young leaves, they will manage to pull back after a little bit of a knockback from a light frost like they did in the spring. But if you can move them into an area where there's a little bit more protection, then that will really help. And as you go on with growing these, the chances are that they will need that, because they are not likely to be ready, depending when you planted them, before our first proper frost dates and the more hardy frost that we're expecting to come. For our tomatoes, so the ones that are growing outside are obviously going to be a little bit more susceptible than the ones that are growing under cover. So for the ones outside, you have a couple of different options. We can try and fleece them. You could also try and remove any fruits that have any sort of colour at all. You can also remove the fruits when they are completely green and then take them inside and continue ripening them from the green stage. To do this, you just want to put them in a basket in a window so they've still got lots of sunlight, and pop a banana or something on top is meant to help as well. If, however, you've got them against a self-facing wall or they are quite protected within your garden, then the chances are that they will be absolutely fine. For our tomatoes in our polytunnel, we have the option again of removing any ripe fruit and then any fruit that is blushing in colour. Because this is around 3°C, I think that's probably the lowest that the majority of the country have got. But if you've got lower, then you may consider taking off the green ones. Or you may find if you've got a heater that will be absolutely fine, and that will give you the time to carry on and ripen the rest. I will be putting the heater on in my tunnel just to give these an option to continue ripening, and then I won't need to get as much of the fleece cloths out in order to try and cover them up. They're big plants, it's going to be very difficult to cover them now. And then our beans, so this is going to be a more difficult one to cover. They are not frost hardy at all, so if we do get a frost, then the beans are likely to suffer from that. Hopefully it's not going to be something that penetrates hard enough that it would attack anything within the actual pods, but any that are already ready, harvest them. And then any that are there for drying beans, I personally am going to leave because I'm not expecting the frost to penetrate hard enough for them, and hopefully they'll continue drying on the plants. It's really a bit too early with the drying beans to remove them all, so the best thing to do if you can with those, and it's obviously going to be more difficult with your pole beans or runner beans, climbing tall varieties, but with the dwarf varieties it's definitely going to be worth trying to cover them with a fleece. Sweet corn, once again, isn't going to be frost hardy, so the first thing that I'm going to be doing is removing any of the corn that I think is ready, and then the rest that is on it that isn't ready, these plants are too big in reality for me to cover them and protect them, so they are just going to have to manage and hopefully they'll be okay. For our lettuce, there's a couple of different things that we need to consider with this. First of all, any seedlings of lettuce are going to want protection, so a fleece cloth over them is going to be really helpful. Any summer varieties of lettuce that you know are not hardy will also appreciate that cloth. If, however, you've got mature varieties of winter varieties that are already quite reasonably large plants, then they should be absolutely fine and not require any covers at all. And then this is much the same for our kale and our cauliflower. So if they're at the seedling stage, so if you've been doing the grow alongs, then they will want a little bit of protection and a bit of a fleece cover. With our strawberries, it's going to be about whether or not they are currently flowering or whether they are just leaves. If they are just leaves, the frost will do absolutely no damage. If, however, they are flowering, then there is a higher chance that the frost could do some damage. So if you've got the ability to, if they're in hanging baskets, to move them into somewhere sheltered, then that's definitely worth doing, or popping a fleece over them. But for the majority of us, we're not actually going to have many flowers, if any, on our strawberries at this time of the year. And then we're going to move on to plants that are not part of the grow along that you might also want to consider giving some protection or will be hardy in the garden as well. So raspberries and blackberries are likely to be absolutely fine and tolerate this lighter frost. The only thing that may be damaged is any plants that are currently flowering, but the chances are that this light of a frost will be absolutely fine for them. Mature celery plants are absolutely fine and there is nothing that we need to do for them. The majority of the peas that we grow are hardy to some extent, so there is very little that we need to do with those, but if you have got plenty that are ready to harvest, then it is worth getting on and harvesting those before. Beetroot, the same as parsnips and carrots, are going to be sweeter and enjoy the frost, so they're absolutely fine to leave. Broad beans and field beans, if you're growing those, whether it's for green manure or they are more mature, they'll be absolutely fine. And now to those plants that are needing a little bit more protection. So our peppers and our chilies are definitely not going to tolerate a frost. If you're growing them in pots and you can move them to a more sheltered position into a greenhouse, polytunnel, or one of the flexi houses, then it's definitely worth doing that. You could also move them against a south-facing wall if you've got no other protection that you can offer, and fleece them as best as you can. And then I will also be harvesting any that are ready on mine as well. Cucumbers is another one that is definitely not going to be hardy and going to tolerate any of the frost. So once again, harvest any cucumbers that are ready on it and then fleece them as best as you can. This is obviously going to be more difficult if they're outside than it will be if they're inside, and it may be that your outside varieties are coming to a natural end now anyway. With our squashes, so for our summer squashes, it's definitely worth picking the ones that are ready and taking them inside, offering them a fleece if they're still very productive. If they're coming to the end of their life, then I wouldn't worry about them. For our winter squashes, if it was a hardy frost, then we would definitely want to be moving these squashes, the actual fruit itself, into the house and start curing them. For a light frost, however, it is likely that the leaves will be a little bit damaged, but the actual squash themselves should be okay. If you are able to offer them some protection, and that can be by placing a cardboard box or something over each of the squash, and also making sure that they are not laid directly on the ground, then that will definitely help. Swiss chard is perfectly hardy when it's a mature plant, but if you have younger plants, then it's definitely going to be worth offering some fleece and protection to them. For our cabbage, we've got a couple of different things to think about here. If it's young seedlings, then it's always worth offering a cover. If it's a winter hardy variety, then they are not likely to need any cover at all. But if it is actually a autumn variety, then they should tolerate perfectly fine a light frost, but they wouldn't want to have a ongoing issue with frost later on in the year. So it's worth harvesting them later, but not quite yet. For both broccoli and cauliflower, the plants themselves are very hardy, but the actual florets are going to want a little bit of protection. This can be done by just tying the leaves over them. For our leeks, we have our autumn varieties, which are going to be absolutely fine with a light frost, but they wouldn't tolerate an ongoing hardier frost, so they will want harvesting before our ongoing frost dates are expected. But for our winter leeks that are expected to be harvested in the spring, they will stand throughout winter and be absolutely fine with no protection at all. So now we've looked at the different individual plants, so other things that we can consider. So we've obviously got our frost cloths, and I've done a video of this previously, of the different types of cloths, the different grades of cloths, nets, and the different protection that they will offer. So do check out that video, and hopefully that will give you more information on this as well. If you don't have any in time, then you could also use old sheets, old quilt covers and things like that. For a hardier frost, we always want to make sure that our covers are not actually touching the leaves. So ideally we'd have some sort of frame to lift the cloth above them so they don't cause any damage. Other things that we can also use at this point would be cardboard boxes or buckets upturned over the plant. If you're not doing so already, it's definitely worth shutting our polytunnel and our greenhouse doors. I still do open them during the day, but on nights where there's likely to be a frost, then it might be that we open them for a little bit less that day. But we do always open them every day, even during the winter, unless there is a lot of wind. Another thing to consider also with cold weather is how and when we water our plants. What we don't want to do is water them just before that frost is due. We can water them the night before or very early in the morning, and the extra water within the root ball should hopefully help heighten the heat within the soil. But what we don't want to do is have them watered just before and then that water freeze. And then other ways to protect our plants, particularly under cover, would be to have heaters. So there are lots of different heaters on the market. We use, I think it's a butane heater, and that does very well within the tunnel of just keeping it up a couple of degrees just to keep the frost off. And then you can also find electric versions as well, so that's going to depend whether you've got access to electricity where you're growing as well. So, really, a summary to all of this, I think, is try not to panic too much. Any plants that are still doing very well, that are on that list of being a little bit more tender, then it's definitely worth getting them and having some protection for them if they can.